Good morning. We are learning Leila Nishmas Mendel Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain, her Nisham Shem Aliyah. We're on Nun Beis Amud Beis, and we've been discussing what animals are allowed to carry. A little hard to follow these Gemaras, not because they're hard to follow, but because it's hard to take something so practical for us. We have Erevs, thank God. Although, it's worth pointing out, in certain circles, they dafka do not use the Erev because they're concerned that people will not know what it means to, when there's no Erev. So certain places where they acknowledge, it's not like they're arguing with, Chazal that Erevs exist. They're afraid that if people use Erevs, they get used to Erevs, then they'll never, they'll show up in a place where it doesn't have an Erev and they'll start carrying, and that's obviously going to be a problem. So it's a little hard for us to relate to these Gemaras because I imagine many of us do rely on the Erev. Anyone here not rely on the Erev? Yeah, we rely on the Erev. And so because of that, it just becomes a little bit more difficult to relate to. Okay, one word, and we don't have like cows. Yeah, exactly. It's really not these types of animals. Okay, nonetheless, we are going to go further. We're at the two dots on the Beis and Beis at the top of the page, about 6 or 7 lines down. And okay, here we go. V'tovlan b'mkoman. So one of the things we saw was that you're allowed to immerse the collar of the animal even while they're on the animal's neck. Now, there's two things that we need to keep in mind with this collar. One is it's on the animal's neck, and as I pointed out yesterday, on the neck, it's not like choking it, or else it wouldn't be able to breathe. So obviously, there's some space between the neck and the collar, allowing some water to go in. However, part of the way how does this collar work? So it goes around the neck, and then there's a hole where a ring goes into that hole, and then there's a rope attached to that ring. Now that ring is very tightly placed into the hole, right? In other words, so tight that the Gemara is now going to ask that it's seen as a separate piece. It's not really one and the same as normally if you have like one item, and it's all one item, then you don't have to separate those items. But they're seen as two separate things. The collar could be separated from the ring, and when something's able to be separated, we actually saw this earlier in the Gemara, then you have to actually separate it for tefillah, or you have to make sure that the water gets through everything. Now this ring, since it could be separated from it, and it sometimes is separated, you'd have to make sure water is able to get in all around the ring. And the problem is it's so tight that the Gemara assumes that no water is going to get through, in which case the tefillah is not going to be a good tefillah. It's only if, there has to be some space, there has to be some distance in order for water to seep through, but this ring is typically placed really, really tight, and therefore the Gemara is asking over here, is about to ask, Va'ike chatzitza, there is a chatzitza, there's no place for the water to come in. So Amar Rav Ami b'shiritcha, he says, you're right. In a typical case of this collar, there is no place for the water to get in, but over here the person hammered it out, in other words, made the hole a little bit wider, allowing the water to go through. Now the Gemara is going to go back to something we saw yesterday. Yesterday, if you recall, we had a question about how an animal ring is able to come tameh, and we saw two opinions, right? An animal ring should not be able to come tameh. So the Gemara said two answers. One, it said that it used to be belonging to a human being, and then it was given to an animal, and therefore it maintains its status as being able to be susceptible to tumah because of that. Alternatively, we saw that since it's used by humans, therefore it's considered a human type of thing. Okay, but going back to that first answer, the first answer is saying that you're right. If it's really an animal's type of utensil, then it won't be able to become tameh. Then it won't be able to come tameh. The reason that it's able to come tameh is because it's really a human type of utensil. So the Gemara now asks, Lema Rabbi Ami Rav Yosef Svirle, Rav Ami, who just said that it was hammered out, must hold like the opinion who holds that that we treat this type of collar like a human utensil because humans use it. Why? Because if you would hold like the other opinion, who said that the reason it's able to come tameh is because it used to be a human's adornment, and then before transferring to an animal's adornment, and that's why it's able to be susceptible to tumah. But the Gemara asks, according to that second approach, kivan deritzchan avu maisa. As soon as a person starts hammering it out, there is a physical action to it which changes its status from its original item as being a human type of utensil, and now it becomes a animal utensil. Uparchala tuminayu, and then tuma is no longer able to happen, and therefore you don't need to have tefillah. It's not because we have a mission that says all utensils could become susceptible to tumah through a thought. What that means is as follows. Let's say I'm making shoes, and until I finish making the shoes out of leather, the leather's not going to be able to come tameh. Okay, so I'm making shoes. Then one day I wake up in the morning, I didn't finish making the shoes, and I'm like, you know what? I don't want to make shoes. I actually want to make a mat for my house, a leather mat, and it's already done because it's just a sheet of leather which I already beat, and it's all perfect. And I had that thought. boom, it's now susceptible to tumah because it's ready to be a utensil. Okay, but on the flip side, vein olim mitumas and el b'shina ma'isa. But when something is susceptible to tumah, the only way to take it out of the susceptibility to tumah is if I do a physical change to it. But the bottom line is we see that making a physical change to something is able to make it no longer tameh. So again, if the whole reason that this ring, this collar is susceptible to tumah is because the fact that it used to be humans, and now it used to be humans. So even though right now it's belonging to animals, right now it's an animal ring, but the bottom line is it used to be belonging to humans, and that's why it's able to be susceptible to tumah. But now we're saying the person beat it. The person changed it, made a physical change to it in order to enable it to be an animal type of ring. So now it no longer has its status as a human ring, it now has a status as an animal ring. And therefore, this answer of it used to be a human ring and therefore it's susceptible to tumah shouldn't make sense, because once the person started beating it, now it's a full-fledged animal ring, in which case it's not susceptible to tumah. You don't have to bring it to the mikvah, right? It must be, we're saying that therefore the Rav Ami, who gave this answer of beating it, must hold of the opinion who says that we're talking about a ring which the reason it's tameh is because it's used by humans and that's why it's tameh. But it can't be that other answer of it used to be a human ring, because then once the person did a physical change to it, it now should have the status of being an animal ring. So the Gemara says no. The Gemara says no. When it said an action changes it and makes it no longer tameh, that's only when you make a negative action, a destructive action. But if you make you make a positive action, you do something to it which actually makes it better, it actually in some way enhances it, that's not an action which will take it away from tumna. Titania, we have a brayso that says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo Amar Shina Mais Lasakin Ela Kalkel. When the Mishnah said that an action causes it to become no longer tameh, that's only when you did an action that is, it's not talking about an action which is constructive, it's only talking about an action which is destructive. Then it loses its status of tumah. And therefore, when the person went ahead and made the ring a little bit bigger, that's not a destructive action. Okay, it's a changing action. Maybe it's not enhancing, but it's certainly not a destructive action. And therefore, we could still say that Rav Ami goes with either one of those opinions, because the action that was done over here is not destructive. It was just something which was enhancing in some way, and therefore we could still say the reason it was susceptible to tumah is because at one point it was a human type of ring. Okay, and therefore we see Rav Ami is consistent with that view. Another possible answer, Masnisa Tani, it was taught in a braysa, bim mechulalin. We're talking about a collar that to begin with has wide holes. Our whole premise of our whole back and forth was assuming that it was your typical collar which has a very tight, small hole where the ring gets pushed forward, but maybe we're talking about one which has wider holes, in which case this whole question to begin with, because there's no chatzitza, because it's a wider hole and the ring is loose to begin with. Okay? End of that discussion. So bottom line is we've reconciled, saying that we've set up a scenario where there's no chatzitza and it's a constructive action. Okay, there's a very important rule by Tumah that if something goes from it goes from its regular status and becomes, and you do something destructive to it, then it no longer is susceptible to tumah. But if you do something which changes it, enhances it, or at least keeps it equal, then it still maintains its status as tumah. Okay? Now, we have some dialogues over here. Shal Talmud Echa Migala Elyon Rabbi Eliezer, a student from the upper Galil, asked Rabbi Eliezer, Shamati shecholkim min tabas l'tabas. I heard that there is a distinction between one ring and another. I don't know what the distinction was. He was almost like, okay, Rabbi, I heard that there's some distinction maybe between two types of rings. Amar lo, Shema lo shematel in Shabbos. This distinction between rings must only be about Shabbos. But it comes to Tumah, there is no distinction between rings. Okay, so what does he mean? So what he's referring to is he's saying, Rabbi Eliezer is responding, he says that the distinction between rings that you're referring to is only by Shabbos. What distinction he's making? The distinction he's making is that if a woman or a person wears a ring that has a seal on it, and you walk outside without an Erev, then you're going to be chayav achatas. That is full-fledged carrying. But if a woman were to wear a ring that does not have a seal on it on Shabbos, then that is not that is only Isser D'Rabbanan. We're going to get into much more discussion about this in the next parak, where it talks about what human beings carry. But that is the distinction. He says regarding Tumah, there's no distinction. All rings are the same. They're all the same susceptibility. There's no difference. And then the Gemara is going to question that. Tumah davada achasi. Is it true that in regards to Tumah, there is no distinction between types of rings? But now we learned in the Mishnah, Tabas and our Mishnah, Tabas Adam Tameya, the person's ring is Tameh, V'Tabas Behema Bechelim Ashar Kala Tabos Taharos. But the ring of an animal or utensils or all other types of rings are pure, meaning not capable of becoming Tameh. So what are you talking about? In other words, the Mishnah, our Mishnah told us that there is a difference when it comes to tumah between types of rings. Human rings are susceptible to tumah. Non-human rings are not susceptible to tumah, right? So Mara's answer is ki kamerle iu nami adam kamerle. When Eliezer told the students that there's no difference between types of rings, he was also referring to human rings. And regarding human rings, there is no difference in regards to the laws of tumah. So Gemara asks, is that true? With regards to human rings, there really is no difference. But Tanya, we have a brayso that says, a ring that is used for the following purpose. Back in the day, we all have like fitted clothing, okay? Even if our clothing, we don't wear like slim fit. We all have, our clothing fits. We are medium, large, small, extra large, whatever. We're all wearing clothing that fits. Back in the day, basically used to have they used to wear like a big robe. And in order to keep the robe like, a big piece of cloth, in order to keep it like tight, they would like stick rings around their clothing and like kind of pull the material through it, and in order to keep it like somewhat fitted on their body so it doesn't fall off. Okay, that is not considered clothing. It's not even considered like a belt. In other words, if that ring is part of a belt, okay, that's already clothing. But if it's just on top of the clothing, the way it's understood is that is something which is more of like a utensil and less like clothing. It's not really your clothing. You're not wearing it. It's not part of it's not a garment. It's something you wear on top of it just to hold your garments in place. And therefore, those types of rings, tahora, they are not susceptible to tumah. The only thing which is tameh is a ring. And the Mefarshim add not just a ring, but also a belt, something that you wear as opposed to something that's on top of your clothing. Okay, but the point is that we do see when it comes to humans, there are rings that are susceptible to tumah and rings that are not susceptible to tumah. So even if you want to tell me, Eliezer was talking about rings that are used by humans, we're still talking, we see that there are differences. So the Gemara says, Ki kamerle iu nami de etzba kamerle. When Eliezer said there is no distinction between rings, he also meant the rings of a finger. So when it comes to Shabbos, there is a distinction between types of rings of a finger. When it comes to Tumah, there's no distinction between types of rings of a finger. The Gemara asks further, even regarding the ring of a finger, there's no difference when it comes to Tumah. But now we have a Mishnah. A ring that's made of metal, where the signet, the thing which they use to stamp, is made of almog wood. Some understand it's ivory, but let's assume it's some type of material which is not susceptible to Tumah. It's Tamea, because the ring itself is metal. He shall almog, but if the ring is made of this almog material, the chosma shamateches, and the signet is made of metal, tahora, it is tahar, right? So you see, there is a difference between rings. Some rings are tameh, some rings are tahora. Finger rings. Ki kamerle iu nami kula shamateches kamerle. When Eliezer said that there's no distinction, he was talking about metal rings. Okay, fine. The Odshal, fine. That we finished that discussion. We learned a couple of laws of Tumah. Fine. The Odshal, the student asked Eliezer another thing. Okay, very interesting student, right? This is not your typical question. It's almost like he's like asking trivia questions to his Rebbe. Okay, fine. Shamati shecholkim ne'machal lemachat. I heard that there is some distinction between one type of needle and another type of needle. Okay, that's what the student said. Rabbi, tell me a little bit more. I heard the distinction between one type of needle and another type of needle. Amrle, Shemalo Shematlin in Shabbos. Maybe this is only regards to Shabbos. What is he referring to? What he's referring to is that let's say again, we're going to see in the next parak, if a woman goes outside on Shabbos with a needle that has an eye, right? It has a hole that you put a thread into it. That is full-fledged carrying. You should not be walking outside with such a needle on Shabbos. That's carrying on Shabbos. But if it's a needle that doesn't have a hole on top, what's it called, an eye on top, then that's seen as an adornment, and therefore she is not going to be chayav on Shabbos for doing so. So he says, in Shabbos,
an adornment.
You and I might not see that as an adornment, but back in the day, that would be, the threshold was a little bit lower than 2024. But that would be seen as an adornment. Well, we'll get into more details of that. So he says, for Shabbos, there's such a distinction. Dealing in Tumah, Davada Achasi, when it comes to Tumah, there's no distinction between needles. Ask the Gemara, in Tumah, Davada Achasi, is it true in regards to Tumah that all types of needle, that there's no difference of needles? But it's not. Machach nital chora, o uksa tahora. A needle, which was a proper needle, and then the person broke off the eye, or broke off the needle, then it's pure. In other words, it no longer is susceptible to tumah, right? In other words, you have a needle which was used for sewing, and then the person broke off the hole, right? Or they melted the hole down, or the needle, the point, they made it no longer pointy. Okay, so in such a case, it's tahora. So obviously there is a distinction between types of needles. Kikamerle, bishleim. The Gemara answers no. Rabbi Eliezer was talking about proper needles, full ones, not broken ones. Of course, broken ones, different story. Rabbi Eliezer was saying, and when you have proper needles, there's no difference. The Gemara asks further. Uvishleima davada achasi. Even if you want to tell me a complete one, they're really the same. But it's not. We have a Mishnah that says machat shelsa chaluda, a needle that became rusty. there's depends how rusty it is. If it's so rusty that you're not able to sew because of the rust, then it's tahar. But if it's not, again, in the way of the sewing, it's tameh. Even when we say it's still tameh, you have to be able to see the needle. In other words, not so covered in rust, you can't even, you could have so much rust on top of it that you won't even notice that it's a needle. Fine, but the bottom line is you see that when it's rusty, then it no longer is susceptible to tumah. So you see there is a difference between types of needles. The Gemara is going to answer what you obviously thought. We're talking about a polished needle, meaning a needle that's not rusty. Okay, there is no difference. Ask the Gemara, is it true regarding a polished needle that there really is no difference? But Tani, we learned in the Brisa, whether a needle has an eye or not, you're allowed to move it on Shabbos. Here we're not talking about carrying anymore. We're talking about muktzah. So if you have a needle, whether it has an eye or not, it serves a purpose. You can use it for different things, and therefore it's not muktzah. Okay. However, but there is a difference regarding tumah, that when it has a hole in it, then it's tameh. When it doesn't have a hole in it, it's tahora. So you see, here we're not talking about where the hole is broken off. Here we're talking about before the hole is actually made, and we're saying because it's not yet a kli. In other words, a typical needle has a hole in it, and therefore, if it's not yet finished and does not yet have a hole in it, we see that it's not tameh. Only when it has a hole, it's tameh. So you see, here it's a complete one ish, and it's not rusty. And the Gemara and we see a distinction regarding tumah. The Gemara answers, we're referring to a case, not that it was. Sorry, I jumped the gun. The Gemara's assumption was we're talking about a needle that's not pierced, that was never planning on being pierced. And the Gemara answers, no, we're talking about a case where it was planning on being pierced. It just we never got around to it, and therefore that's equivalent to a non-shlema, non-complete one. In other words, the Brisa, which just said that machat she'ena nekuva is not tameya. It's talking about a case where it was not yet completed. You didn't yet finish making it. In that case, you can understand why it's tahora, because it's not yet made, which is the equivalent of what we said before, that Rabbi Eliezer is not talking about ones which are incomplete. Granted, it wasn't broken off. It's just that it wasn't finished in the process. And therefore, again, Rabbi Eliezer, when he said there's no difference between needles, was referring to ones which were completed, and this is not a complete needle. Okay? End of this Gemara. Now we're going to get into some more animal-related carrying halachos. And a new Mishnah. We'll just see the Mishnah and we'll start the Gemara, God willing, tomorrow. Chamor, a donkey, yotze b'maradas b'zman shirvo, is let it go out with a saddlecloth. The reason it wears a saddlecloth is because apparently donkeys get very cold. I did not know this. But donkeys get very cold, and therefore they would have saddlecloths on it. It's like a normal type of clothing for it. But it has to be tied on. Why does it have to be tied on? Because again, there are two concerns. There are going to be two issues that we're going to come up with that when it comes to carrying items. One is this considered a clothing? Is it not considered clothing? Right? So, all right, that's one question. The other question is, even if it's considered clothing, if it's something very loose, then there's a concern that it might fall off and the person might carry it, right? So we have to say, it is clothing, but it has to be tied on tightly so that there's no issue. Zecharim yotzim levuvin. Rams may go out attached. The Gemara is going to define what this means. Rechelos, use, right? Use. Yotzos, shechuzos, kevulos, uchavunos. They're able to go out held, tied, and fastened. Okay, the Gemara is also going to define what that means. Ha'izim yotzos shruros. Goats may go out with their udders tied up. Okay, now why do people tie up the udders of their goats? One of two reasons. One is they tie them really tightly in order to dry them up. Okay, they want to dry them up. They don't want them to be nursing anymore, either because they want them to become pregnant, they want them to get larger, whatever the case is, like more engorged, like sometimes it's good for the owner. One way or another, that's one thing you could do. So you tie them very tightly in order to dry up the milk. The other is you do it to catch the milk. In other words, also you could tie it up because sometimes it's just dripping and it wants to catch the milk, so you put the tie it up. So he says either one is fine. Rav Yossi says all these cases are asur. The only case that's allowed is for the ewes to get fastened. Is it ewes or ooze? No, ewes, right? Ewes. Yeah. Okay, fine. Okay, fine. Okay, so they're allowed to go out fastened. All the other ones he disagrees with. The Gemara is going to explain what the machlokas is, but he holds all those other ones are carrying. This one is not. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he's going to argue on the last halacha. Izim yotzos shruros liyavish. They're allowed to go out if it's tied up for drying, but not to catch the milk. Now, it's not that he disagrees with something intrinsically different. It's just the difference is how tightly you tie it. When you're tying it up in order to dry up the milk, then it's very tight. Then he says it's fine. But if it's being done just to catch the milk, then it's not tight enough, and therefore he's afraid it's going to fall off, and that's why he forbids it. And the Gemara is going to discuss these different opinions more as we go along. Let's now go back to Michtam Eliyahu. So we're in the middle of this piece about God's attribute of kindness. So the last thing we saw was the fact that there is kindness that is manifest on the premise of din. That's the terminology they use. It's the foundation of din, but it's manifest as chesed. So what was that? It's referring to schus avos. Meaning, a person receives kindness even though they don't deserve it, but because of the fact that they're connecting themselves to their forefathers, it's just. It's just because, as we saw yesterday, it's not like protexia that's illegal. It's protexia. It's understandable. If we say we're connected to our forefathers, we say like, "Hey, Abraham, okay, Yaakov, I aspire to be like them. I really am like them," etc., etc. Then Hashem says, "Okay, I'm going to be more compassionate to you." But it's based on it's predicated on din, on absolute justice, because that is what a person really is deserving. There is the opposite though, and here we're going to spend some time getting into some of the discussions of tzaddik v'ralo, how God runs the world, and he's going to lay out a couple of different ideas that are important to think about when we see the way Hashem runs the world. We'll see it's not just so simple. Good things happen to good thing, be good people, bad things happen to bad people. It's a lot more complicated. One of the examples he gives is a ben sura mora. He says that this is a ben sura mora is an example of din, which is based on a foundation of kindness. Okay, what's the halacha ben sura mora? Ben sura mora is this child who is rebellious, who we ultimately will kill if he goes ahead and does a couple of sins, which normally would not be worthy of capital punishment, but nonetheless we will punish this child, we'll kill this child. He says, what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, nidon al shem sofo. Right? The Gemara says that the reason that the ben sura mora is killed is because of what's ultimately going to happen. So what does that mean? What that means, he says, again, if we believe in a world to come, if we believe in an Hashem, if we believe that ultimately the goal is to connect to Hashem deeply through our purity, through how pure we are, and then if we know someone, or even if we don't even say we know someone that has, statistically, there is a very good likelihood that this child is going to go on a path where they're going to be a murderer, etc., 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 then it's actually in their best interest for them to be taken out of this world after they've done some very minor crimes, because in doing so, they haven't really severed their soul, severed their ability to connect to Hashem in this, while they're still alive. And therefore, when they pass on, they'll be able to connect to Hashem in a very deep fashion. That's the idea of ben sura mora. He says now, the Gemara tells ben sura mora never happened, according to at least one opinion brought in the Gemara, but it teaches us a principle, that sometimes you find din, you find Hashem acting in a severe fashion, but it's coming from a place of kindness. It's foundation of chesed, but it's manifest with din. That's a principle that will apply to other cases. Again, ben sura mora is the extreme case, but there'll be other cases where Hashem acts in a more strict fashion to us, but it's actually coming from a very compassionate place. So that's din that is predicated on chesed. Okay, and that's just one example. Again, we're going to go. Let's talk about another example, one that's very relevant to Shavuos, and it really goes back to schus avos. He says schus avos ideally is that we connect ourselves to the merit of our forefathers. But there is another basic level of schus avos, and that is that we believe that we as descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, at some point we believe Mashiach is going to come, and to the Jewish people, our ability to be here in this world. He says, well, let me give the example, then come back to us. But he says, there's a discussion in the Torah where the Jewish people were considering attacking Ammon, Moab, and Hashem says, don't touch them. Why don't touch them? Because they're going to be two great righteous people. One of them, more famous, Rus, is going to come about from this nation, and therefore don't attack them. He says, what's going on over here? But that's like a bunch of generations from now. The answer is, yeah, because sometimes a person, this nation, those people's entire worth in this world was to be the connecting chain to the future. And for that alone, they were saved from hardship. And he says that schus avos sometimes is manifest in that fashion as well. On the most basic level, sometimes maybe we're not worthy. Maybe we don't connect ourselves to our forefathers, but we'll still get positive merit because we are a link in the chain into something else, whether it's our child, whether it's 10 generations from now. But the point is that sometimes we could have a positive judgment just because, not because of my own merits, but because of something that's going to happen, because of what's ultimately going to come from me, come from you. And that is the more basic, lower level of schus avos. The bottom line is, again, it's just another example where, judgment in this world is far more complex than we sometimes give it credit for. It's not just like, okay, you did a mitzvah now, you just learned right now, so now you're gonna get, you're gonna win the lottery tomorrow. What you want is gonna happen tomorrow. No, there's a whole complex system, and these are just some examples. We'll get into more examples as we continue this quite a long piece. Okay, have a great day.